So what we're going to do now is create a login handler, and the job of our login handler is going to be to check the username and password, or the email address in this case and password, against our user store, and if the password matches then we log in the user. Well, we don't, because we're actually building an API. So what we're really going to do is when we log in a user, we need to return a token to the user, and we'll come on to that. But for now, what we'll do is we'll create our login handler. So I'm just going to clean up my windows here and scrunch these up as well. And inside the application, let's create a new folder, and I'll just call this folder user. And inside this folder, I'm going to create a new C# class and just call this login. Now, our login handler, even though we're posting data to the server, we're not actually saving any of this data into our server, so it's going to be a query in this case. So let's use our query handler snippets for this one. So what we're going to return from this particular request at this stage is the app user, and this is just temporary because we wouldn't really want to return all of the properties inside this to our end user, but for now we'll use that, and then let's just bring in our imports for this. Now, unfortunately with C# there's no way to bring in all of the missing imports, and we have to bring these in one at a time. And let's bring in the data context and also the system threading tasks and system threading, and just reformat this as well. And inside our query, what we need to do is send up the user's email address. So we'll have a property for email and the property for the password. Now what we'll also do is validate this request as well. And the only reason for adding the validation is just to make sure that we don't even bother with our database if there's a missing email or a missing password from our query. We may as well end the request now and say you're missing an email or missing a password in this case. So what we'll do is we'll add a public class query validator in this case, and we'll make it derived from the abstract validator, and we'll pass in our query, and we'll need to bring in Fluent validation to use this, and we'll need to give this a constructor. And then inside here we're just going to add two rules and say rule 4, and in the expression say that the email is not empty, and we'll just do the same for the password as well in this case, and we'll need to add semicolons as well after this. So let's take a look at our handler logic now then, and what we need, we don't actually need the data context in here actually, so I'm just going to remove that, and instead of the data context what we're going to be using is the user manager, as we're going to need to retrieve the user from our database, and then we'll also need the sign-in manager so that we can actually use the user and the password the user sent up to compare against our database and sign in the user. So let's bring in the user manager, and we need to specify the app user entity here and call it user manager, and we'll also bring in the sign-in manager, which also needs the app user entity as a type, and just call this sign-in manager. And what we'll need to do is also bring these in from ASP.NET Core Identity, and we'll also need to create the private fields for this as well. So let's initialize field from parameter and do the same for the sign-in manager, and I'll just remove list dot from both of these as well. So let's add our logic for list then, and what we want to do here is say var user equals await, and then we'll use our user manager to find by email async, and then use the request.email to get our user. Now, if we don't have a user at this point, then what we're going to do is just return an unauthorized, because the user is trying to sign in with a user with an email address that we don't have inside our user store. So I'll say if the user equals null, then what we'll do is throw a new REST exception, and we'll need to bring in our application errors. And then we'll say HTTP status code, and to use this we'll need to bring in system.net, and we'll just use unauthorized and send that back to the client. We won't specify the object inside here with any errors, just a 401, which is the status code we're sending back, is good enough for this. And then what we want to do is say var result equals, and we'll say await sign in manager, and we want to use the check password and sign in async to attempt a password sign in for a user. And then in here we need to pass in the user object that we already got from above, as well as the password, and this is going to be request.password. And what we also need to do actually here is provide a third parameter, which is a boolean, to specify if we should lock out the user on failure. And I'm just going to set this to false. And after this, what we want to do is we want to check the success or failure of the result. So we'll say if the result is succeeded, then what we really want to do inside here is return a token to the user. So I'm just going to add a to-do and say generate token. But what we're actually going to do for now is just return the user object. And if the result is not successful, then what we'll do is we'll throw a new REST exception, and we'll just use the HTTP status code of unauthorized. So this will allow us to check that we can actually log in with a user, and if we are successful, then we're going to get this user object back. Now we're going to need a user controller, but before we get to that, because we're going to start adding additional controllers, what we're going to look at next is creating a base controller so that we don't need to keep adding the same attributes to every controller we create. We'll just derive from a base controller that we use here. And we'll take a look at that next.